So today we'll be discussing the history of the Jewish faith as outlined within the Torah, as outlined within the first 5 books of the TANAKH, Pentateuch. And we'll see within this history various agreements that God has had with the Jewish people and with humanity at large. So we begin with what we saw in Genesis that we talked about a module ago, 2 modules ago. The fact that God created the first man and the first woman, and through them, the mother and father of the rest of humanity. And they lived in an idyllic setting. They lived in complete harmony and peace with all their needs completely met. And it was only because of a choice they made to go against God's wishes that they were expelled from this idyllic state. They were expelled out of Eden. And as a result, they would then start to feel pain. They would start to suffer. Eventually, down the line, humanity develops and grows. But again, we turn wicked. We turn on one another. We are in conflict. And God decides to start the world anew once again. And he does this through the use of a great flood. So I'm sure many of you have heard of the story of Noah and his ark. So God had tasked Noah with creating an ark by which God could save various creatures on the face of the earth from this flood. So it's through Noah that mankind has restarted again because of all the conflict and wickedness that had occurred eventually. And then through the Noah line, we are led to who's considered to be the father of the Jewish people, Abraham. Now, as we mentioned last time too, Abraham is a very important figure for Christianity and Islam, since all three of these religions trace their heritage back to Abraham. And Abraham is going to be important for several reasons. One, Abraham is going to be a prime example of faith. And two, it is through Abraham that we see somebody adamant about proclaiming only one God, the need to have faith in only one God. So Abraham lives within Mesopotamia, and during this time period, the common practice was to be polytheistic. The common practice was to worship various gods based upon location, various gods based upon natural artifacts, gods of rain, gods of the earth, gods of the sun. But it is through Abraham that we see a voice cry out for the belief in one God, that we should have faith only in one supreme being. God asks Abraham, or tells Abraham, that Abraham will be the father of a great nation. Now, Abraham is bewildered by this, and I'll tell you why in a second. God says, Abraham, you will be the father of this great nation, and you will have to travel, though, to set up this nation. Now, what was interesting for Abraham was the fact that Abraham, at this time that he hears God speak to him, is already very old, 70 years old, and has already settled into where he is currently living in Mesopotamia. And his wife, Sarah, had been barren, was unable to have child. So it seemed bewildering to Abraham to hear God say that he will be the father of a great nation, since seemingly they're too old to have children and his wife is barren, and they need to do this by traveling in order to establish this nation someplace else. But Abraham has faith. Abraham has faith in this one true God and says, okay. So him and his wife decide to go ahead and travel, and they're able to do it. And not only are they able to travel and survive, but they're then able to also have child. So they have, within the Jewish faith and the Christian faith, they have Israel, Isaac, and it's through Isaac and Isaac's line that Christianity and Judaism are born. Now, this isn't the traveling and the birth of a child isn't the only two examples of great faith. So knowing that Abraham has had such difficulty having kids, knowing that Sarah has had such difficulty having kids, Abraham is put to a great test. God asks Abraham to sacrifice this son. To sacrifice this son whom Abraham and Sarah had just received from God. An interesting question would be, what would you do in such a situation? What would your instincts say to do when God, the one true God who you had been proclaiming for all of this time, who has led you well into this new land, who had given you the child that you thought you never could, what if this God then tells you, you must sacrifice your son? The story of great faith is that Abraham had faith in this God, had faith that if this was what was God was asking me to do, then this is what was meant to be. So God prepares to sacrifice his son. And just as he was about to sacrifice his son, physically sacrifice his son, God says to stop. And here we see an example of somebody having great faith in God. Now, what does this mean? Just like when we took a look at the Bhagavad Gita, I would caution you to think deeply about what mythos could be being expressed with this story, and with all of these narratives that we'll discuss about Judaism. But we'll return to that in a second. So Abraham has his son Isaac, and Isaac has his son Jacob, and Jacob is also called Israel. And Israel means he who wrestles with God. And this is going to be a very important term, something to keep in mind as we continue discussing the Jewish story, the Jewish narrative here. So the new kingdom, this new nation that Abraham is meant to establish, is now referred to then as Israel. Eventually, though, the Israelites, the Hebrews, will face a famine, a great famine, and they will have to flee their land and venture into Egypt. And in Egypt, they multiply and flourish, and this is worrisome to the rulers of Egypt, to the Pharaoh. So the Pharaoh decides maybe what's best is to enslave the Hebrews, enslave the Jewish people. And it is here that we enter into the narrative, the story of Moses. And it is through Moses that God calls to help free the slaves out of Egypt. And then we will be introduced now to the second covenant. So, the name Moses might be familiar to you. So Moses is associated with this concept of the Exodus, the great leaving from Egypt. So Moses is asked by God to lead or free his slaves from Egypt, to help free the Jewish people under the rule of the pharaohs. So Moses is able to do this. Moses frees the slaves, but in order to leave Egypt, they have to cross the Red Sea. And so maybe you're familiar with the idea of Moses being able to part the Red Sea, or asking God to part the Red Sea. And as a result of that, the Jewish people are able to cross the Red Sea to flee Egypt. Now, here's Moses wandering through the deserts, this whole area that we looked at in the map on, I believe, is our previous module. This is all Middle East. This is all desert land. So here they are wandering through this desert. As they're going towards this promised land, this land of freedom, to establish a new Israel, Moses is given the Ten Commandments on Mount Sinai. It is here that he receives the Torah, these books that we are now discussing at this moment. And it is through the reception of the Ten Commandments that God has entered now a second covenant with the Jewish people. And it is at this point that he refers to the Hebrews, he refers to the Jewish people as his chosen people. So let's take a look at these commandments that were given to Moses. Do not worship other gods. Do not make any idols. Do not misuse God's name. Keep the Sabbath holy. Honor your father and mother. Do not murder. Do not commit adultery. Do not steal. Do not lie. Do not covet. Now, on the surface, the language might seem very authoritarian, right? Like somebody who's laying down strict laws of what thou shalt and shall not do. But I'd ask you, again, to take a mythos approach and to ask yourself what might be expressed here. So think about this idea of not worshiping other gods. In one sense, this seems very egotistical, right? You can't worship anybody else. You must worship me. But you might want to take a look at what it means to be God for the Jewish people. What we've seen so far, and again, this takes us back to a mythological approach to what we saw in terms of the history of the Jewish people up until this second covenant. We see this notion that God wants us to live this perfect place, but we make choices that lead us out of that perfect place. We want to discover good and evil. Right? We want to know about good and evil. Because up to this place in Eden, at this point in time in Eden, everything is perfectly fine. So we don't really know evil. So we want to know evil. So we choose that. Because of that choice, we're led out. We're expelled from this perfect state of Eden. And then again, here we are living on the earth, and what are we told? We're told that we're wicked. We're told that we make decisions and choices that go against harmony, that go against living well in a society. So God decides to restart the earth, again, because of choices we make. And then here is Abraham, who's given this seemingly crazy task of traveling across the desert to establish a new land, to establish a new nation, even though he's very old, even though his wife is barren. He's asked to sacrifice his son, even though this is the son that God himself had promised to Sarah and Abraham. So mythologically, what do we see here? What does this say for how the Jewish people have experienced their world, experienced their life? What we see is lots of examples where God wants the best for us, where God wants us to live in peace and harmony and to flourish. But it's our choice that leads us astray. The idea of faith, why is that so important? Well, what happens when we don't have faith? The world is naturally chaotic. The world is naturally unknown because we can't know every single thing that's going to happen in our lives, especially out in the desert, especially out in the harsh conditions where these people lived. When we don't have faith, we often act out of fear. And when we act out of fear, we often cause conflict. Because if I don't know what somebody else is doing, if I don't know what my food's coming from the next day, if I'm afraid of these things, I may act irrationally and may try to harm somebody before they harm me. So we have this notion that faith is of key importance. Having faith is of key significance. And with faith, maybe it's possible that we can lessen conflict, that we can live more in harmony because we're no longer so worried about our own survival that we take advantage of other people. So here, when we see the idea of not worshiping other gods, you have to ask yourself, what does this mean to worship the God that Abraham says we need to worship? Well, it's this God that frees slaves. It's a God that wanted humanity to live in a perfect state. So maybe the idea here, by having a commandment that says to not worship other gods, this may not be such an egotistical sort of commandment, but maybe it's a commandment about, hey, don't worship anything um, other than this sort of life, the Creator who had wanted you to have a great life. Don't worship any other thing other than the source of freedom, other than the source of freedom from bondage, freedom from slavery. And maybe you can relate this too to the notion of not making any idols. Well, don't worship anything other than the types of concepts and the types of values represented by the God of Abraham. Don't worship money. Don't worship power. Don't worship, right, these sorts of ideas. 3, do not misuse God's name. In some sense, people will reflect on this as being not saying the word, right? We notice saying the word God in a way that's blasphemous or in a way that's disrespectful. Another way of thinking about this possibly is to not justify actions that go against what God wants for us by saying it comes from God. Right? If we see a story within Adam and Eve, and within Abraham, and within Moses in the Exodus, if we see a story where God wants us to live in harmony and peace, so He doesn't want us to be enslaved, then maybe this notion of not misusing God's name is about not deviating from these principles of freedom and harmony and peace, and justifying that by saying God wants us to be in conflict, that God wants us to be enslaved, or that God wants us to have slaves. 4, keep the Sabbath holy. If you've noticed in your life, maybe sometimes you've seen how distracted we get, how we have so many different things that pull our attention, right? Like our work and our school, and maybe a boss, and maybe it's things like possessions and materials that we want, right? So we get distracted by doing everything we can to get the house or the car, or to get the status, right? The type of job title, and as a result, we kind of forget what the purpose was. We forget what we really want in life, right? This harmony and peace and compassion, getting along with other people. So maybe the idea of keeping the Sabbath holy is about remembering that, remembering what it is that we really want, that what God really wants for us. The others, maybe you can see how these can lead to more social cohesion. Right? Maybe you can see how these 5 through 10 lead to ways in which communities can stay together. Anyway, just one way of interpreting the 10 Commandments. So, after the Torah, we have the Nevi'im, and we get into history after the establishment of this new Israel. So the emphasis in the Nevi'im is on how lots of calamities occur to the Jewish people, again, as a result of disobeying God. So first, here we are, and we establish this new united Israel um, through King Saul at first, and then eventually through King David. And it is through King David that we are told that we are at the high watermark of the Jewish people. This is the great King David, and under the great King David, we have a flourishing of the Jewish people. And then after David, his successor is Solomon. And with Solomon, there is the building of the first temple in Jerusalem. And this is very important, right? Because now we have a temple to worship the one true God. Again, as opposed to being polytheistic and having our attention drawn to all these other sorts of gods. It's here within the first temple that all our attention now is given to the one true God. We can now properly honor our faith in the one true God that helped restart the world so that we can live in a less wicked environment, a world where we are more faithful to not just God but to one another, and a world in which we are free from slavery and bondage. However, eventually, this kingdom collapses, right? This nation of Israel collapses. And then Israel split into two. There's Israel and then there's Judah, and it's conquered by the Assyrians, and then later on the Babylonians come in and they exiled the Jewish people. And when we say exile, we mean they all dispersed. They're all forced to leave their nation of Israel, and this is referred to as the diaspora. And also, as a result, the first temple is destroyed. A second temple is built later on, but that then is also destroyed. Now, within the Nevi'im, despite the rise and falls, despite these hills and valleys and these turbulent times, we see a story of a God who still does not give up on the nation of Israel, still doesn't give up on the Jewish people, but continues to seemingly be on their side, trying to show them that there is ways of living a life that still is flourishing. So, In this really brief summary of history and covenants, what can we say about the Jewish people? Well, there seems to be this sense that, there's lots of difficulties in life. That the history of the Jewish people is one of setbacks and calamities. Yet there's always a way to there's ways to overcoming these calamities. There's God there to help us through these valleys. And even though times may be difficult, we are shown a way of making meaning out of what we go through. We are shown that there's ways to find hope and meaning even though we face despair over and over again. And how do we do that? Well, it's because within the Torah and the Nevi'im, we see a story of a God who continually cares about his people. If you think about, and I think we mentioned this in a previous module, but when we think about when we think about polytheistic sorts of cultures, oftentimes these gods would be in conflict, and they'd fight one another, and they'd be in conflict with human beings. Here we have a story of a God who's not in conflict with human beings necessarily, though I can see how some people might see that. But it's much more about a God who is loving and is continually wanting us to have a good life. Yet we make choices that stray away from that. So it's a different narrative, right? We have a narrative of a God who sticks by us, a deity who's sticking by us and looking for the best, wanting the best for us, despite all the times we choose to make choices that deviate from what God wants. And we should mention that what God seemingly wants throughout this entire narrative is just for us to live a certain life that's happy, to live a life that's flourishing. Now, let's return to this whole idea of the term Israel, right? He who wrestles with God. Can you see how appropriate that might be for a way of thinking about the Jewish people? Why they're often called Israelites? There seems to be this back and forth, this tussle, and it's not really a tussle with God per se, but it's a tussle for doing having behaviors and having actions that lead to what God wants us, that lead to the life that God wants us to have. So let's try to recap some of the key ideas then up to this point. When we take a look at how human nature is described within this historical narrative, we see that human nature is not described as inherently sinful. So for Judaism, unlike Christianity, there's no notion of original sin. Right? Human nature isn't born flawed to automatically make choices that stray away from well-being. Humanity isn't naturally born to have to make decisions that cause conflict. Instead, we have choice. Judaism teaches that within us is potential for both good and evil. There's no entity like a devil who pushes us towards evil. There's no original sin that makes it so that we continually choose evil. For the Jewish people, it's a potential within us, but we always have the choice to choose evil, to stray away from God, or to choose good, to fall in line with the types of behaviors that lead to the life that God wants us to have. The goal, seemingly, then, is the life that God had always intended, this life of cohesion and harmony that He had originally set us into in the garden. Now, how are we supposed to attain this life now? Since Adam and Eve made choices within the garden to kick us out, since we made choices as the original first humans that caused God to wipe the slate clean, what is it that we can do now to enter into this sort of life, to reestablish our relationship with God so that we can enter into the type of life that God had intended? Well, the idea for the Jewish people is that we need to fulfill the covenants. We need to fulfill the agreements between humanity and God, between the Jewish people and God. Now, why might the Jewish people be referred to as God's chosen people? If you think about how Houston Smith addresses this in the textbook, he notes that within Judaism we have the exemplar for what we need to do in life, for what humanity needs to do in life. We have the exemplar for how to best live our lives, to be faithful to God. So the Jewish people can be seen as God's chosen people, in the sense that they are chosen to show us the way back to God's good graces, back into a proper relationship to the divine. And we need to do this by fulfilling the covenants, which we'll talk about in our next section.